So, this is Hope as a sexual violence advocacy practice in rural programs. And this is the first live webinar in the Fabric of Healing series. So, here are our learning points for today. First, we're going to contextualize healing centered advocacy. And then we're going to reflect on the importance of hope as a part of healing centered advocacy and services. Before lastly, today, we're going to identify practical skills and strategies for promoting hope and resiliency for rural survivors and their communities. But before we start to focus on hope, we have to first contextualize that with healing. Now, this is going to be more of a speed run because we already have a mini episode that's available that dives into healing and is already available for you all to view. And Nora just put that in the chat if you would like to access it. But for those of you who haven't had a chance to view that mini episode, it's called A Crash Course on Healing. Then we're going to quickly review how we define healing at the RSP. So, what is healing? We define healing as caring for the many parts of oneself that have been interrupted by trauma: physical, emotional, social, mental, spiritual, and more. And so we think of healing as an active process that requires care and attention. One of the main reasons why we focus on healing services for the Center of Sexual Assault Advocacy is that it's a direct response to the needs of sexual violence survivors. But how do we know that, right? How can we make such a bold claim that this is one of the needs of sexual violence survivors? Well, before, the Resource Sharing Project has done extensive resources with sexual violence survivors. And this is some of the direct needs that came from them when we asked them what were their top needs. And consistently, it was these three: they were to be believed, to receive consistent emotional support, and have healing and safety be available in their lives. And so these needs are different from what we've heard from domestic violence survivors. For domestic violence survivors, a lot of the things that they need are more standardly available, tangible, and revolve around a crisis and immediate safety. And that's not the same for what we know of the needs of sexual violence survivors. So, again, you probably heard me say this many times before. If the relationship is different and the needs are different, then the way we provide advocacy also has to look different. And we know that there are some intersections between domestic and sexual violence, but we're going to focus today about the needs of sexual violence survivors. And even if healing is one of the most common needs for sexual violence survivors, as much as we can encourage them as advocates, healing is something that only survivors can determine for themselves. It's going to be an extremely individualized process that's going to be influenced by someone's identity, their background, their past and current experiences, and the availability of resources. So, what helps me heal isn't going to be the same thing as what helps you heal or for the survivors that you're working with. Along that same lines, healing is going to be a deeply personal experience. So it has to be self-identified, and survivors has to discover for themselves what helps them feel regulated and calm and more peaceful. It also has to be self-motivated. And so survivors have to find their own healing, and it has to be tailored to what their specific needs are. And that doesn't mean it will happen fast because of their perceived effort or lack of what we think is effort, but it has to be something that they want to do for themselves. And then it also has to be self paced. Survivors should know that their healing journey is going to be unique to them. How long it takes them to find healing is going to depend on them alone, and they shouldn't compare their healing journey to anyone else's. We also want to remember that healing is not linear, and a survivor's journey could go fast at one time and then slower at another time because of what happened. It's going to be, again, unique and always their own. And the reason we focus so much on healing for sexual violence survivors is because it isn't limited to systems responses that have very set outcomes that may or may not align with survivors' needs. So we know that the vast majority of sexual violence survivors do not report to law enforcement, and that's for a variety of different reasons. But one of the primary reasons is because of how sexual violence is handled within systems. When sexual violence survivors do interact with the criminal legal system, oftentimes the cases do not end up quote unquote successful or end in a conviction. So, from the most current research from RAIN, for every 1,000 sexual assaults, only 50 lead to an arrest, 28 cases lead to felony convictions, and only 25% of perpetrators are sentenced to incarceration, right? So we started off with 1,000, and then of that 1,000, only 25 then are sentenced for a conviction. So that is literally 2.5%, right? And so that is not a lot at all. But beyond low conviction rates, when sexual violence survivors do interact with the criminal legal system, they find that systems are not able to meet their needs, or they're only able to meet a very narrow set. Only certain cases that are deemed to have enough evidence are even brought forth to trial or potential trial at all. Survivors also found that the systems can take away their ability to choose what they want from them. So even if they decide they want to make a report, there is an arrest, they want to talk with the prosecutor can decide, the prosecutor is the one who decides how the case moves forward. So oftentimes when cases are brought, they're brought by the state, right? Not an individual person. We also know that survivors don't always get the outcome that they want and needed through the criminal legal system, right? So even if a survivor is able to share their story, they are able to make an arrest, do all the things that are involved with the criminal legal system, it may not end up the way that they want it to in the end. So, a question for you all. How many of you all know who Chanel Miller is? And Chanel is Chanel Miller. How many of you all have heard of Chanel Miller? And you can do reactions, you can say yes in the chat. How many of y'all have heard of her? Okay, so I'm seeing some raised hands in the chat. I saw some reactions. And some people are saying no. That's okay. This is why we come to things like this so we can learn together. So Chanel Miller, uh, you all might know about uh, it. You all may know about the the quote unquote Stanford swimmer rape case. Chanel Miller is the person who was sexually assaulted, and she has asked that people know her name, and that is actually the name of her book that she wrote about her experience. So Chanel Miller was sexually assaulted when she was unconscious after a party, and her case did go to trial. And in that trial, there is a lot of things that happened. One of the things that happens was she was called terrible names online, and before the trial, her name was anonymous, right? So people were saying terrible things about her online who had no idea who she was. Um, when so the person was eventually convicted, but at that sentencing, that person's father said that this shouldn't ruin their life for 20 minutes of action. That's how they described the sexual assault that Chanel experienced. And the judge in the case actually, at the sentencing, said a lengthy term would have a severe effect on his life. So the person that sexually assaulted Chanel. So again, she did the things that were supposed to be done, went through the process, and that was still the outcome, right? And so for Chanel and a lot of different survivors, this is not just a one off experience. When they go through the criminal legal system, oftentimes after, they don't feel safe, relieved, or healed after what happened. And so, if we want to circle back to what the needs were for sexual violence survivors before, right? It was to be believed, to have consistent access to emotional support, and then also be able to heal and find justice. Survivors don't always receive that when interacting with the criminal legal system. In fact, some survivors are more traumatized after interacting with systems than they were before the interaction started. And so the criminal legal response has certain restrictions that healing centered advocacy does not. With healing centered advocacy, we can help survivors no matter when the violence happened. It could have happened 48 hours ago, a week ago, a month, a year, or even a decade or more. Healing center advocacy could still be available to survivors for support, even if there's no evidence to be collected. It's also available whether or not the survivor reported or cooperated with law enforcement or was involved in the system at any point. It's also available to survivors no matter where they are in their healing journey and where they are with their life experiences. The services that someone will need at age 7 are not the same services they'll need in their teenage years or at 34 or at 74, right? And that may change depending on when the sexual violence happened in their lives as well. It also takes into context the people interacting with survivors and what support they might need, regardless of whether or not they were the primary victim of a crime. Healing center advocacy allows us to focus on all the places that sexual violence exists and affects, from those who are just bystanders to secondary survivors, or those who are love and care about survivors, to the primary survivor, or and those who cause harm. It also acknowledges that we need to prevent, stop, and respond to sexual violence on every level of our society. And so when we can focus on healing center services, we can meet survivors exactly where they are in their healing. And so one of the biggest reasons that we focus on healing centered advocacy is because they can holistically address all the areas that were affected by sexual violence. So some of you might be familiar with this chart, but we call it the areas of hurt and healing. And we use this chart to demonstrate how survivors have different areas in their lives that were hurt after they experienced sexual violence. But typically, what we see from services is a focus on helping survivors with their body, obtain basic needs, and maybe some a little bit with their mind, right? So therapy is offered as a very available response for sexual violence services. But when we focus on healing centered advocacy, and if we want to say we can holistically serve sexual violence survivors, we have to focus on all the different areas in survivors' lives. Related to that, right? Survivors also have areas in their lives where they can find joy, and these things can also serve as places where they can find healing. So, for an example, if the survivor experienced sexual violence, there might be an adverse effect or a negative effect in their relationships. But when they start to heal, they might rely on their spirituality or going to communicate and be around people in their faith community. And that might provide some healing in their relationships, but also in their spirituality. And so it's really important for us to realize that what happens in one of these areas affects the other areas as well. So when we consider healing and providing healing services, we also have to consider how to support survivors at each of these different areas. And because this is going to look different for every survivor, we have to have a wide variety of healing resources available for survivors to choose from. And so that begs us to ask this question. If we say that we want to holistically serve sexual violence survivors in our community, what resources are we going to need to be able to do that? What services do we need to offer? And how are we going to do that? And so, specifically, when we talk about sexual violence interventions, we are also including prevention in that. What are we going to do to prevent harm, sexual harm, in regards to sexual violence, in regards to sexual violence survivors' bodies, right? So, what does that look like to prevent it? Again, we also focus on what that looks like for individuals, their families, or their loved ones, and also in entire communities as well. And so Nora has linked a resource in the chat that's also available for you all. That is a copy of this chart and some questions you can ask for each of the different areas. So what happens when our advocacy is really healing centered? It allows us to meet survivors exactly where they are. And that isn't just a phrase to us at RSP, that's an active process. So when we say we meet survivors where they are, we're available despite how they may present. We offer services without barriers, and we are physically and emotionally present when needed to provide and offer support. Also, Healing Center Advocacy is founded upon the principles of trauma informed care. And so that means that we're not looking at the person as the issue, but instead the trauma as something that can be addressed and that we can help survivors find healing from. We also consider the survivor and their environment for places for intervention and not just the survivor on their own, because we know if we're just focusing on individual survivors, the violence will continue to happen around them, right? So we have to look at everything in context. Healing centered advocacy can also benefit survivors who didn't get the outcomes they wanted from systems. And again, that can happen at any point. Even if a survivor changes their mind about what route they want to take, healing centered advocacy can still be available. It's also beneficial to advocates as well. So, some of the feedback that we've often got about doing sexual violence advocacy is that the advocates didn't really feel like they were doing anything, right? Someone called, they weren't able to access the services that were available. Other supports weren't available in the moment because it's at night or the weekend. And there isn't anything tangible that they can do about their situation. Even in situations like that, advocates still have the ability to actively listen. And so, if we are still able to provide that emotional support to the time where survivors need it, that is doing advocacy, that is doing something. And so, if our mindset of providing sexual violence advocacy services is, did we provide support? And we did, we can consider that successful advocacy. All right. So now we are going to do a Mentimeter. And so if you've never done a Mentimeter before, what you can do right now is go to www.menti.com and then type in the code 2420 2221. Or if you have your cell phone available, you can point your camera at the QR code. And so I'll give you all a couple of moments to do that before I switch my screen. So give me a second. I'm going to switch my screen. Possibly. Okay, great. So you all have already started to generate answers, and you all can see the Mentimeter, correct, on your screens? If someone could give a thumbs up or
Yep,
yes
we
in the
can
chat,
see
that
it.
would be great. Thank you so much, Nora. Okay, so you all are already starting to generate answers. And this first one that we're doing is a word cloud. So the more people say a specific word, the bigger it will get. The question is, what are some of the emotions a survivor may experience after sexual violence? And another way to think about it is, how might a survivor feel after sexual violence has happened? So I'm going to start to read some of the answers now. The first one, the biggest one, is shame. Then we see fear. There might be some anger, confusion or feeling confused, guilt. They might feel ashamed, scared, depressed. Let's see, anxiety, powerless, angry, shocked. There might be a loss of trust or distrustful, humiliated, violated, empty, hopeless, unbelieved, sad, overwhelmed, shocked, distraught, disgusted, unsafe, and embarrassed. Yeah, worried and not safe. Hope, shocked. Yes. Thank you all so much. Yeah. Distraught, overwhelmed. Oh, yeah. Suicidal. Yes. Thank you all so much for your answers. I think you all are very much in tune from what we've heard from survivors about how they feel. And these feelings may change over time or in the context of what happens in their lives, right? So they might feel one way immediately after the sexual violence has happened, or immediately after the realization of sexual violence happening. And then once people start to find out about what happened, that could change how they feel again, right? So this is how our circumstances and our experiences can often change over time. And then with new experiences, this can also change how we feel about the sexual violence that happened. So, for example, um, some sexual violence survivors feel very traumatized while pregnant or while giving birth after sexual violence has happened, right? It's a deeply physical experience that is unpleasant at times, and there's a lot of things that can happen without survivors' consent. Some survivors feel very anxious while making big life decisions like buying a house or purchasing a car or getting some type of government documentation. That can, again, bring up a lot of experiences of feeling out of control and not having choices in survivors' lives. So it's important for us to think about this and keep this in mind about how survivors feel after an experience or several experiences of sexual violence. So thank you all so much for your answers. So again, you all brought up a lot of good points, right? About a lot of the common things that we hear from survivors: fear, embarrassment, shock, anger, shame. All of these things that we hear from survivors for a variety of different reasons. And so, while advocates cannot tell survivors or make survivors feel anyway, we can and need to support and interact with them so that they can find healing after sexual violence. So, we're going to go through this chart. And on one side, on the win side, is when a type of feeling that happens. And then on the other side, it's the then feeling and what we can do as advocates or how we can intervene in the lives of survivors and navigating those feelings. And these are just some different examples of how we can help them through providing emotional support. So when survivors feel discouraged or they feel like they don't have a future, then we can help them find places of goodness and belief in a better or in change in their life. And we can help them explore dreaming and healing for them and with them in an intentional way. If survivors feel worthless and devalued, we can assist them in discovering or rediscovering their value. And when survivors' experiences go unheard or aren't responded to, we can amplify and validate their contributions or their value. When survivors feel unsafe within themselves, we can help them find security within themselves or within their body. And when survivors feel insecure about external factors, right, like their reputation, their safety in the community, how to interact with others, we can help them establish or reestablish safety in multiple contexts. And I want to also emphasize that there is a lot of re on this slide and the previous slide. So reestablish or establish, because we know that for some sexual violence survivors, they might not have ever felt safe. And so we might be helping them do that for the first time or find new ways for those who have felt safety before, but that's been interrupted or stopped because of sexual violence. If survivors feel disconnected in multiple ways, then we can help them explore ways for them to connect, reconnect, and disconnect on their own terms. And particularly when survivors feel disconnected in multiple ways or feel insecure about their connecting, then we as advocates should help them explore, connect, and reconnect in ways that feel safe for them. So, all right, wrapping up, right? If we know that emotional support is one of the key needs of sexual violence survivors, and survivors can feel discouraged, worthless, unsafe, and disconnected after sexual violence, then the role of the advocate is to help promote the opposite of those feelings in our services and as our services so survivors can heal. So we want to make sure that we're framing our services to inspire hope, worth, security, and connection in the lives of sexual violence survivors. And so that's why today we're starting with hope as our first frame. Essentially, if we're doing sexual violence advocacy to support the needs of sexual violence survivors, then our role has to center on those needs too. And so when we provide healing centered advocacy and frame our services under these concepts, it enables survivors to meet their needs and for them to eventually thrive. So now let's really focus in on hope. How does hope intersect with sexual violence, and how can hope impact rural communities? So, we define hope as the belief or trust that things can change for the better. This is the ability to believe and want better, to stay and not give up, to want to fight for another day or a better tomorrow. And hope is the reason for some people to live that tomorrow, or maybe the next day, or maybe the day after that, but eventually things will change, even after something as devastating as sexual violence happens. Hope is an important frame for healing centered services because this belief can shift things for survivors, their families, and for our communities. It can't change everything like things have happened in the past, right? So hope will not make the sexual violence that survivors have experienced go away or any of their previous traumas go away. And it's important that in our advocacy, when we're talking about hope, we understand that, right? And don't present hope as a band aid for every bad feeling, because that's not going to be helpful to survivors. And false hope is also not helpful to survivors. But hope can help people imagine a different set of circumstances from what they have encountered or what they're currently experiencing to something better. Hope can also help people get ideas to how they can navigate through negative feelings and look for places to find support, how they can imagine what it feels like to respond and react differently to outside influences, and also impact when they start to heal or if healing is a possibility for them. So let's take a closer look about how hope can impact an individual survivor's experience. Avi was sexually assaulted by a customer where he worked. After he got off his shift, he called the non emergency line to try to make a report. The person on the line told him, quote, honestly, there's nothing we can do about it if there's no cameras to prove that she did it, unquote. The woman came in about 2 weeks later with her friends and started filming Avi while he was in the restroom. Avi was later fired from his job after missing too many shifts. He tried to tell his boss what happened, but they told him, quote, that's just a part of the job, period. And so I want you all to tell me in the chat, in this scenario, who discouraged Avi and how? And what and who impacted Avi's ability to be hopeful? Who discouraged Avi and how? And who impacted Avi's ability to be hopeful?
And this is Nora with tech support. I'll read out some of the answers in the chat. Non-emergency discouraged by saying there's nothing they can do. Whoever answered the non-emergency number discouraged them. The person he called prevented him from being hopeful based on their assumptions. A couple people say his boss discouraged by saying it's just part of the job. Lachey, you're on mute.
You. Um, Getting used to a headset is is a little difficult for me, everyone. I apologize. So we intentionally use this example because there are only two examples of sexual violence on the slide, right? There is one about contact sexual violence and one for non-contact sexual violence. But we use this example because we want to demonstrate that even when our intentions are good, we can still cause harm when we assume what will happen. So I am not at all telling you all to hide the reality of outcomes for survivors, right? We started this webinar in talking about the realities of criminal legal prosecution for sexual violence. But I am telling you that what we say has an impact, especially on vulnerable people. So the person um who heard Avi after the sexual assault happened, they probably had the best intentions, right? They wanted Avi to know, like, this may not be worth your time. However, what we say has power. So we want to make sure that we're balancing the information that we have and survivors' ability to choose what they want and what they need for themselves. So again, only two of these things that happened were sexual violence experience, but all of the things that happened on the slide in this context had a profound impact on Avi. People discouraged him from utilizing the options available, made it clear that he would not be kept safe at work, and they thought that there wasn't anything that could be done about sexual violence. And so that feeling, especially like there isn't anything that could be done or it's just part of the job, and when that happens on a societal level, is a part of rape culture, right? And so I really want to focus in on Avi's job for just a moment. Not only, right, there is nothing that his boss could have done to go back and stop the sexual violence from happening. But there are things that we can do in a variety of contexts to prevent it and stop it from continuing, right? And so that feeling or that apathy or like lack of feeling like there's anything we can do is part of the issue when it comes to um, responding to sexual violence. Oh, and someone's also said the person who assaulted them. Absolutely, right? They affected Avi's ability to be hopeful at work, right? That's part of the reason why Avi started to skip work. And so it's important that we put the responsibility on all the people involved that affected Avi. Again, uh not everyone sexually assaulted or did sexual violence against him, but everyone in the situation did impact Avi by their actions. And so thank you for bringing that up. There's also research that has been done about how hope impacts healing from sexual violence. After sexual violence, like some of the things we talked about earlier, survivors cite feeling a lack of motivation for life, feeling trapped or disengaged in everyday activities, or when doing things that previously made them excited. And there's also been a correlation of those who feel hopeless after sexual violence with higher rates of post traumatic stress disorder and depression. But one of the strongest correlations found in the research was the connection between hope, sexual violence, and suicidality. Several studies have found that there was a relationship between the lack of hope and suicidality. Survivors of sexual assault are 10 times more likely to have thoughts of suicide than those who have not experienced sexual assault. And then people who have experienced child sexual abuse were more likely to be hopeful than people who experience sexual violence later on in life. And so, without the hope for the future, survivors can't heal, and many won't see the point of living, due in part because of that lack of hope, right? A lack of belief that things will get better or change for them. I also included the last statistic on the slide to highlight the resiliency of children and youth, and we as advocates to make sure that we're encouraging the youth that we're working with and helping them reinforce their resiliency because that's going to be really important. The messages that we hear during our youth and our childhood and how we navigate and cope with trauma can impact the rest of their lives. And so, particularly in rural communities, hopelessness can also feel exponential or grow quickly and fast. So, I'm going to spend a little bit of time here and I'm going to explain why this chart is at all linked to hope. So, overall, and if you are doing work or have done work in rural communities, you might know that rural communities lack some resources that are available in urban areas. That is just usually a trait in rural communities. And that's not just talking about sexual violence services. There are so many resources that just don't exist in rural communities or they're no longer funded in rural communities. And each of these resources contributes not only to survivors' ability to meet their needs, but also it affects their loved ones and everyone else in the community as well. So things like phone and internet connection, basic needs and benefits, natural disaster support, affordable housing, and sometimes housing, period, jobs and education, and then healthcare as well. And so this overwhelming lack of resource contributes to what's known as rural flight. And this is when people from rural areas move to more urban areas in search of opportunities. And that also includes staff at rural sexual violence advocacy programs. So, as a result, survivors are at an even greater disadvantage when rural programs close due to staffing issues. And it's not just the people that leave. With them leaves innovation, new ideas, sustainability, economic viability, or the ability for their financial growth to expand, and growth in general for the community. And I really want to highlight internet connection for a second because I acknowledge that this webinar today is being done virtually. But especially in today's time, having internet connection is essential, not only for leisure and for fun and for free time, but also for work, for paying bills, and other important aspects of other people's lives. So, for example, if a survivor is unable to physically attend our support group, they may have the option of participating virtually if they have stable internet connection. But again, in rural communities, internet connection isn't always stable, isn't always affordable, and it may not be stable enough to maintain a video call. So, how does all of these different things link back to hope and what we're talking about today? So if people in our community aren't able to access what they need, they're if they have the ability to, they will leave. And the community will slowly begin to die or be stagnant and stay the same, despite the needs of the people still there. And from there, they won't be able to attract investors. And again, not just people who have money, but people who want to invest and contribute to all types of growth in the community. They won't be able to attract them and those outside the community won't see it as worth it. And so if people in the community don't believe things can change, they're not involved or invested in pushing forward changes and don't contribute to these changes, or if they don't see the need for changes or think things are just fine though the way they are, that's going to leave survivors in these places and in these communities without resources, without opportunities, and without hope. And so, if we think about who is often left behind, even in rural communities, it's often the people who are most vulnerable and those who experience high levels and high rates of sexual violence. Taking that a step further, if people in rural communities don't view sexual violence as an issue, they don't believe it's something that can be prevented, and don't think the community is able to intervene or able to intervene differently when sexual violence happens, then sexual violence survivors will continue to not get what they need. And so, this is why we want to use hope as a frame for our services because we've observed it and how the lack of hope can affect sexual violence. So, for survivors, hope can help them imagine what life can look like after and beyond trauma by connecting to what has or what can potentially inspire them or bring some changes in their life. And then when individual survivors feel hopeful, that spreads and has ripple effects. When there are changes to how individual survivors, how they communicate, how they talk about their experiences, about how they navigate the world, they can then become examples for others in their lives, and not just other survivors, but motivation to all other people around them. Within families, hope sparks the idea that families don't have to stay the same. We don't have to be this way. That the way our families interact with each other can be healthy, safe, communicative, and balanced. And when that happens, family members will respond in a different way and support those who are being hurt and hold and support those who also cause that harm, but again, holding them accountable as well. Hope doesn't erase what happened or the harm that happened within families, and that includes sexual harm as well. But hope can make the norms within families and push us to make changes when sexual violence is disclosed within them. And sexual violence can stop. And with hope, hope can help us prevent sexual violence from happening to new family members, right? So stopping intergenerational sexual trauma. And then we go to the community. Within our community, if we have hopeful families, we have hopeful survivors, and we have hopeful advocates, who are out spreading hope and inspiration to others around them, other people in our community will start to believe that change is possible, in part because they've been witness to it. Now, and especially in rural communities, this is not a process that's going to happen overnight. And change on the community level is usually slow and sometimes difficult. But with the encouragement and investment, people will transform from believing that change is possible to actively participating in change. When hope starts to take root in our communities, the collective mindset moves from it can't happen to it can't happen or it can happen and I've seen it happen to we can then make it happen. When the community is invested and everyone believes that they have a role to respond to it, that is when we can see the sexual violence stop in our community and be prevented, and we all have a role in responding to it. Now, sometimes hope gets conflated and confused with toxic positivity. So it's important that we discuss this because we want you all to be intentional about how you talk about hope and again how it's different from toxic positivity. So Wikipedia defines toxic positivity, also known as excessive positivity or positive toxicity, as a dysfunctional emotional management well without the full acknowledgement of negative emotions. Now, already this definition doesn't align to what we talk about and how we talk about healing from sexual violence because we're trying to help survivors get in tune with their emotions. But for some survivors and sometimes advocates, and I'll be the first to admit, I have often defaulted to toxic positivity, right? But in the long run, that doesn't serve us and help us do what we want to do for healing from sexual violence. Some signs of toxic positivity are experiencing guilt for being sad or angry, dismissing others' difficult feelings, hiding painful emotions, ignoring your problems, and reciting positive quotes about hard situations. A few examples of what toxic positivity could appear like in conversation, and this came from an article from Psychology Today, are if a survivor says, I don't know if I can have a relationship with my sister. She doesn't treat me with decency and respect. And someone then responds, she's family. You should love her no matter what. Another statement, work has been stressful lately. The response, you're lucky to even have a job. Another statement, I'm having a hard day. Response, but you have so much to be grateful for. Right? So again, someone states something's difficult and you are ignoring it, brushing off, or saying at least. So, a couple more things about toxic positivity. Oftentimes, we cling to it because it's what we have, right? This is a coping response. And I don't want to say that having control over our mindset isn't beneficial and that thinking positively can't help us move us forward. But it's also important to remember that feelings do pass. But if we're only being positive, right, and we're only doing this in isolation, or we're doing it to the point of obsession, then it's probably not helpful to us. A website called Hopeful Panda says that toxic positivity is harmful because it invalidates and suppresses real emotions, leading to stress, depression, and coping issues. So ultimately, this leads and toxic positivity leads to the very thing that it's trying to avoid in the first place. So, for example, take reciting positive quotes about hard situations. If we're only when something bad happens to us just saying, just keep swimming, just keep swimming, just keep swimming, the reality is we're probably not going to be able to really respond to the situation because we're ignoring it, right? And so on its own, doing positive affirmations and then trying to take stock of how you're emotionally feeling and Noticing when you're feeling sad and guilty and giving yourself time to feel those feelings is helpful. But again, if we're just doing one of those things to the point of obsession or we're ignoring everything else and we're not grounded in reality, it's probably not going to help us. So in our advocacy, we want to aim for hope rather than that toxic positivity. So overall, hope is grounded in the reality and plans for the future, while toxic positivity is unbalanced and it's a display of good feelings that are really only surface level. So on the left side, these are things that, and then this is how toxic positivity might sound like. And then on the right side of the screen, these are some things that hope might sound like in response. So the first one, everything is for toxic positivity. Everything is perfect. Things couldn't be better. While on the other side, hope says things aren't going great right now, but I think things might turn out okay. So instead of ignoring the things that aren't going well, hope acknowledges the bad and knows that it won't last forever or be this way always. Hope doesn't encourage us to pretend for others that we are okay. Number two, toxic positivity. I'm fine. I don't need any support. Rather, hope things might be hard right now, and that's okay. I can ask and offer help when I need to. Hope acknowledges that everyone needs support at one time or another, and for things to improve, we might need help from others to do that. Number three, if I just think positive, everything will be okay. Rather, hope everything may not be okay right now, but I believe that they can get better. Hope also makes room for rest. So, if you all have watched Finding Nemo, um, one of the main characters, their name is Dory, Dory. Their catchphrase is "just keep swimming." And so, hope is not about us racing against the current until we can't swim anymore and we're overexhausted. Hope instead encourages us to push forward with the current, but take a break when we need to. And then the last one, I'm done healing. Rather, hope says healing is a practice and I'm doing my best. So, hope also acknowledges that healing is not a place that we land, right? Sure, we hope that over time and through intervention, survivors won't be as traumatized or experience the same pain at the same levels that they always experience as a result of sexual violence. But healing and how we heal and what we need for healing will change as we change. And hope really survives on the ability or the active want of people wanting and trying to heal. So, to ground us again, hope is not just a wish. It's not telling or expecting survivors to be happy and smile all the time. Hope, instead, is an active process that survivors can choose for themselves. And it's not the only thing that they need for healing, but it's often where healing can start. So, we've talked about the research, the effect on survivors, and the effect on communities. But this is the core reason why we choose hope as as one of our advocacy frames. Hope has the power to change outcomes. Hope helps survivors believe that there can be healing beyond this painful moment. And so, in the chat or with reactions, how many of you all watching today have played sports or been on a team of some kind? Okay, I've seen some reactions come up. So I have played sports before, and here in the United States, there is a common chant in some K through 12 schools or in schools or high schools in particular. And it goes, I believe that we will win. And as people start to say that over and over again, it spreads, it gets faster, and people start yelling it along with the person who started it, and it goes even faster. So they go, I believe that we will win. And they just keep saying it, and it grows and it grows and it grows. So even though the person who typically started the chant is not playing, the belief and hype from the audience can alter the atmosphere or the feeling on the field or in the arena. And knowing that others believe in your ability, whether that's the crowd or the coaches, or in our case, advocates, can help survivors believe in themselves and believe in others. And it's also similar at concerts, right? So I'm not sure if any of you have been to a concert lately, or maybe it's just to the concerts I've gone to. But something that commonly happens is people will chant one more song, right? And sometimes that can influence the artist want to come out and perform the last song before closing the show. And so we know it's not the only thing that can change the outcome of things, but it can influence how and when things can happen. All right. So I'm going to ask you all to go to the Mentimeter again. And we're going to do another Mentimeter. So the QR code is again on the screen. And if you have logged out, you're going to again go to www.menti.com and then type in the code 24202221. Or you can use your phone and point it at the camera. Use your phone and point it at the QR code. Oh, so I am going to switch screens now so we can see the results on the Mentimeter. Okay, so what we all want you all to do right now is to add songs that help you feel hopeful to this Mentimeter. And if you can add the name of the song and the artist in your submission, that would be really helpful to us. And so I'll wait for the moment for this to start to populate. And again, what song helps you feel hopeful? So far we've got Here Comes the Sun, Let It Be, I Will Survive, Gloria Gaynor, Don't Stop Believing, Queen, Here Comes the Sun by the Beatles, Brave by Sarah Bareilles. I know I messed that up. I apologize. Stronger, Pocket Full of Sunshine, Natasha Bedingfield, Everything's Gonna Be All Right, Bigger by Beyonce, Stand Up by Jasmine Sullivan. Yeah, these are all great submissions. So I encourage you all, as you're thinking, keep adding to this list, right? Um, One of the things that can all usually help people feel hopeful is music, right? It can change the feeling. Music is at morning rituals. Music is used in faith communities, and so a song, just like a chant, can also help people start to feel hope. Okay, so I encourage you all the as our time together continues, if you think of another song, go back to the Mentimeter. It should still be open throughout the duration of the webinar today. And with that, now we're going to go ahead and take a break. So I am going to pause the recording, and then when we'll come back, we'll jump right into the webinar. Alrighty, everybody. So I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A. So we're going to go ahead and keep going. But if in any point there are questions, please feel free to let me know. Okay, so we're putting into practice now. We're grounded in the why for hope. We've seen the research. We got background for effects on survivors and individuals and communities. But let's actually do it. Let's actually offer the services now. So, to support you all in doing this learning, we have created two new resources on the topic, and there's going to be a workbook for advocates, and there's also going to be a workbook specifically for survivors. So, the survivor workbook really focuses on how survivors can use hope in their healing. It's specifically for survivors. The advocate workbook is designed for advocates to explore and consider how to utilize hope in their individual advocacy to shape the services that they offer. And so that resource will be online and available soon. When it is, you all can check the rule listserv, and I'll have a link to where they can be found on the RSP website. We're excited for you all to be able to access that. So first, we want to hear from you all, right? Because as much as I can talk about some different ways, some different things to explore, it has to come from you all. What are some things that you can do to inspire hope in the lives of the survivors you work with? What are some things that you can do to inspire hope in the lives of the survivors that you work with? Big and small, short term and long term. And please put your answers in the chat.
This is Nora. I'll read some of the answers. We've got not assume what I think will be best, but listen to the survivor on what they need. Listen to them with unconditional positive regard.
Listen to them with unconditional positive regard. I could not have said that better myself. That was amazing. Meeting them where they are, absolutely, right? These are the things that we can do to be hopeful with, and sometimes and help them lead to hope for survivors, right? No expectations, no judgment. Okay, so let's keep going. Thank you all for those answers. So, in our advocacy, ooh, someone said talking with them instead of talking at them. Absolutely right. Thank you all again for those answers. So here are some reflection questions. If you, in that last discussion we just had, were like, I'm not quite sure, here are some questions that you all can use for your brainstorming, for reframing our services, and reframing our advocacy around hope. Asking the survivors, how would you define hope? And thinking about what actions can we take as advocates and within our program to encourage survivors? What can we do to promote a survivor's sense of hope in their lives? And what can we do to help survivors' lives in a way where they feel is a more positive direction? And so I want to validate that any talk of making major changes to our programs can be unsettling, be hard, and feel difficult. But to truly provide services in our communities that survivors will use, and more importantly, the services that survivors deserve, we must make radical changes to our programs. And that comes straight out of the lessons from the Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative. So, what could hope look like in our services? A couple of you already said the first one, right? Engaging in deep, active listening, uplifting resilience, expressing non judgmental belief, and asking survivors what hopes they have for themselves in their healing process. Hope as a service starts with validation, like, I believe that you can make it through this, even if that looks different from other people. In particular, just making space for survivors to imagine what it could look like to have hope and what it is that they hope for could be a part of the skills that we offer. And someone said earlier, talking with them instead of talking at them, right? Just making space for them to even imagine what could hope look like. And again, sometimes when you're in survival mode or you're navigating crisis, you don't have that space. But we as advocates can make that space for them to do that in the ways that they would like. When we make space for survivors to explore without judgment and when they want to, that can be a service. And knowing how to hold space is not something that everyone in advocacy knows how to do well. Particularly with sexual violence survivors, providing services at a non rushed yet encouraging pace is needed for survivors to unpack and to be able to address their trauma. So, we're going to watch a video of what highlighting resiliency as a skill could look like. I'm just making sure that when I shared my screen, I also shared the sound. Okay.
You need to run your business. You shouldn't have to worry about your financial partner. First Bank always has been perfect about being able to understand.
I think we all need a pep talk. The world needs you to stop being boring. Yeah, you. Boring is easy. Everybody can be boring, but you're gooder than that. Life is not a game, people. Life isn't a cereal either. Well, it is a cereal. And if life is a game, aren't we all on the same team? I mean, really, right? I'm on your team, be on my team. This is life, people. You got air coming through your nose. You got heartbeat. That means it's time to do something. A poem. Two roads diverged in the woods, and I took the road less traveled. It hurt, man! Really bad. Rocks, thorns, and glass. My parts broke. Wah! Not cool, Robert Frost. But what if there really were two paths? I want to be the one that leads to awesome. It's like that dude Journey said, don't stop believing, unless you dream stupid. Then you should get a better dream. I think that's how it goes. Get a better dream and keep going. Keep going, and keep going. Will Michael Jordan have quit? Well, he did quit. No, he retired. Yeah, he retired. But before that, in high school,
So if you all have a chance, I encourage you all to go back and watch the full video, right? But this is a way and different ways that we can start to highlight resiliency and not giving up as a skill. And again, this is not never taking rest, but not giving up because there is something to look for and things to look forward to, and being able to find places of that and examples of that in survivors' lives is a skill.
Wolfie.
But specifically for sexual violence advocacy, what can this sound like or be like? I believe that you can make it through this, even if it looks different from everyone else. I'm sorry that they didn't believe you then. I believe you now. It's okay to take a break as long as you give it your best shot. Now, it's really important that advocates are skilled in communicating hope as an advocacy frame. And remember, right, this leads back to one of the needs of sexual violence survivors being they want to be believed. So not only do we need to believe them when they talk about and share their experiences, but we also need to believe that healing is possible for them, even when they don't see it in themselves. We also want to highlight the strengths that survivors have that can help them reach their goals for healing, whether that's recognizing their boundaries, they're taking the time to rest, if they're moving apartments. We want to highlight where they are making changes or making movement. This can also look like you can do it. I like the way that you were able to set the boundary with me and tell me that we need to stop meeting. Things are hard right now. What is one thing that you have to look forward to? And I also want to give the caveat, right, or the disclaimer that this sounds like cliche, and these are things that I would say. But when you're working with survivors, you need to adjust them to the way that you communicate. And here's another piece of information that I'd like you all to think about. If survivors are sharing with us and we jump to giving perspective to them, or instead of providing validation, or if we're shaming survivors or ourselves for feeling bad or not reacting in a way we would or how we think people should, especially in tough situations, that's probably a symptom of toxic positivity instead of hope. But even if we're providing the most hopeful, most encouraging messages and communicating with survivors about being hopeful, they may not be in a position to receive that in the moment. And that's okay. It's not a requirement for survivors to be hopeful with us or a requirement for them to be able to access services. But our job as advocates is to make sure that we're providing motivation and support and validation and the option for them to feel like things keep getting better if and when they need that. Hope as an advocacy frame can only be effective when it's applied in the right moment. So, if survivors are telling us about the violence they experience, we should not be smiling and just nodding along and then starting with, well, at least you did something, right? That's not hopeful. And that's not empathetic or appropriate at the time. But when survivors are feeling down and unmotivated, providing some encouragement and validation could be helpful. And that is where hope comes in. And this isn't something that we communicate verbally either. Now let's look at some specific services that we could do and demonstrate that can help us demonstrate hope. So hope as a service encourages positive feelings towards the future. And so when we're thinking about how we can do this, we want to focus on things that can help motivate survivors, highlight resiliency, like we talked about before, embody or demonstrate change and growth, especially when it comes to learning a new skill, and things that can help survivors plan for the future. So, some examples of this is goal planning with survivors, encouragement cards, so writing them a note that says some type of encouragement, doing a cheer squad, helping them learn a new skill, and also investing in some type of peer mentorship. And so we're going to go over some more examples in depth in a moment, but some other services that we could also offer are doing affirmations and helping survivors with mindfulness or gratitude exercises. Again, these are not done in isolation and they are not done to the point where they are just a platitude or a thing that we say. But these are combined with other healing modalities or other healing options for them to be able to heal from sexual violence. Okay, so we're gonna watch another video, and this one focuses on the effects of peer modeling and how that can work as a service.
Part of the best part for me of the Men's Project was not just talking, but listening. My fourth group at the Men's Project, I heard my first testimony, and a friend of mine to this day. And it struck me profoundly. He said out loud that he had been raped. And he had strength in his eyes. And I thought, holy God. There was 8 of us in the room. He was looking proudly and talking about being raped. And I thought, holy shit. And I realized I want what he has. I want that. It was an incredibly moving feeling of discovering, totally discovering for myself that recovery is actually possible. Well, it wasn't happening totally yet, but I began to really believe that if I worked at this, my life would not be ruled, dominated by my childhood. That the demons and the darkness didn't define me anymore.
Okay, so this is an example of how peer modeling can be an effective strategy for showing survivors what healing could look like for people who experience something similar. Another service that we can offer in our programs is gardening. So, gardening involves some type of movement that can be intense or as gentle as we choose. So, if we do a single pot, that might not be labor intensive, but if we are doing a community garden, that might involve a lot of moving around, a lot of physical work. And so, as an advocacy program, we need to decide what type of gardening we would like to do. Gardening is also a service that we suggest for for hope as an advocacy frame because it can be done inside or outside depending on the amount of space that we have. And in real programs, often something that we have a lot of or a lot near us is space. Gardening also works because this can be you can do a variety of gardens. So they can be flowers, they can be just greenery, they can be food, which are that can be vegetables or fruits. So there's a lot of different types of gardening that you can do, and this also can be linked to gardens that are linked to the cultures or the communities that you are working with. That variety in the type of gardening that we can do can also help people see that under different conditions, things can grow. And there's so many different lessons that we can learn from working with plants and gardening for sexual violence advocacy. But another reason that gardening works so well when we're talking about hope as a service is that we as humans benefit from interacting with other living things. And gardening is a way that we can see things grow and change with or without human intervention, even though human intervention can make a choice and it sometimes helps. If you're me, I don't do well with plants, so this doesn't resonate with me, but it's another solution for how we can engage different people and different types of services that we offer. Another reason gardening works well is because plants aren't completely reliant on us for growth and change. And while this can help survivors identify something they can interact with that could benefit from their intervention, it isn't something that's completely reliant on them, such as an animal or another person. And so the visualizations that also that the visual aspect of watching something grow is something that can also be helpful, even if it grows slowly, right? So that shows that over time things do grow and change, and what it started out in the beginning, it may not look like that at the end. Another idea of things you can offer as a service, and this can be done individually or with groups, is creating vision boards. Now, vision boards are a way for survivors to define what they would like their future to look like for themselves. And this can be abstract or as concrete as they would prefer it to be. This can also be a way for survivors to set their intentions and their goals for healing and then revisit them at a later point to see what actually occurred. When working with groups, vision boards can also create a space for participants to share with others. And like Scott talked about in that video, to receive that peer-to-peer validation or engage in peer modeling. Vision boards can also be a way to and be completed as an in-person activity or a virtual activity, which allows people to stop and start when they need to or when they choose. And lastly, I really like vision boards for groups because those materials are often more widely available and relatively inexpensive. So if you have access to paper, even just newspaper ads and glue, you can make vision boards. And because we really want to support you all in the work that we're doing, we created a lesson plan for you all to do vision boards in your programs related to hope. So that resource that we created includes instructions, directions, and discussion guides for you all to do vision boards. And like I said, linking that back to hope. And so Nora has put that resource for you all in the chat, and I hope it's helpful to you. So let's go back to and do our second discussion question for today. What makes you personally feel hopeful? And where are there places of hope in your community? What makes you feel hopeful? And where are there places of hope in my community? In your community? What makes you feel hopeful? And where are there places of hope in your community?
This is Nora reading the chat. One person says watching nature, birds, etc.
Watching nature and birds? Absolutely. Nora, can I ask you what makes you feel hopeful?
I think seeing the ways that people find their own avenue toward healing, especially when it's as we've talked about, it's not something that is the same for everyone, and watching people walk through that process is very inspiring, I think. We also have a couple more answers in the chat now. We say I have relying on my faith to get me through. Places would be at a park, being connected with others, spending time with friends and family. Community parades and big community events give me hope. Fresh air and support group.
Yeah, again, all of those things are very individual, right? So for example, rain gives me hope. I live in Arizona, and so that's very hopeful to see rain in our environment so that the plants can grow. For some people, snow gives them hope, right? Because the holidays are coming, so on and so forth. That is not hopeful for me because I don't enjoy snow. But hope has to also, just like our services, be deeply personal. And so, what makes your community feel hopeful is where we should dig into and really build services around hope and do our advocacy around hope, right? So, if there is a yearly event that you see there's a large turnout for, how can we replicate some of the things that are done in that event in our advocacy services and bring that feeling inside our program and inside the support that we offer to survivors? All right. And so we are going to, our last section for today is talking a little bit about choice points and what tangible skills can we as advocates use to inspire hope in our advocacy. But before we get into that, we want to make sure that we're all grounded in what emotional support is. Emotional support is the way we connect with survivors and start understanding their traumas, hurts, joys, and how that connects to their healing. Now, notice that it says start understanding. There is never going to be a point where we fully understand all the things that impact survivors' abilities to hear. But providing support can help us get some context for that how that happens. Now, particularly in rural communities, feelings of shame and blame, like you identified earlier in the Mentimeter, can be amplified because of the social environment. Providing emotional support and connecting with the survivor on an emotional level in a place where they may find no or little support can be life saving. And I know that sounds dramatic, but we know, and we talked about, there's a connection between survivors feeling isolated and like there is no hope, and then experiencing suicidality or dying by suicide. There's a connection there. So even though it might seem insignificant, the way we approach survivors' feelings can make a huge impact. So, how do we make sure that we're equipped to support someone who has experienced sexual violence? We want to make sure that whatever the person has used to cope with what happened to them is how we are acknowledging that as such, right? So we try to stay away from saying healthy and unhealthy coping because we know that's a judgment statement, right? And survivors are doing whatever they needed to survive. So we want to make sure that if we disagree with a choice that a survivor has made, they should never know that. Our advocacy is always supportive and neutral. We also want to remember that we hold some power and authority in the spaces that we're in with survivors. So we have the ability to connect them with resources and potentially control their access to housing or not give them support. And so that's important that we acknowledge that, right? And we want to make sure that we are always supporting the decisions that survivors make. And again, if we disagree, they should never know. We also want to take time and be intentional about being empathetic, transparent, warm, and clear. And we also want to remember that when we think about what services that we offer, emotional support is a service. So there's somebody on the helpline. The sexual violence happened decades ago. The person that harmed them is no longer living. They still want help. They still want to heal. By providing emotional support, that is how we can still offer them services. So, here are the 5 different skills that we have defined that advocates need to be able to do to provide emotional support. And so, today, we are going to focus on choice points and what that looks like for sexual violence advocacy. Choice points are a moment where people can pause and actively make a decision. So we know that for survivors of sexual violence in particular, they might have a hard time making choices because sexual violence in and of itself is a violation of the choices that they had, right? And so anytime that they might have to make a choice, that could be re-traumatizing and re-triggering or emotionally activating. We also know that survivors are blamed for the choices and actions related to the sexual violence they experience. So, common myths about sexual violence are what sexual violence survivors wore caused them to be sexual violence, what they did or didn't do caused or prevented them from experiencing sexual violence, and other things surrounding that. When we know the reality is nothing they did or could do would prevent sexual violence. The responsibility is on the person that harmed them. Another reason that making choices can be difficult is because there's usually a lot of different choices that could be made, and that can be really overwhelming for sexual violence survivors. And then, as a result of sexual violence, or maybe not, survivors may often defer to someone else making decisions for them or to help find safety, to avoid blame, or to appease other people. And so, to make sure that you all have an understanding of what that can look like and what choice points are, there's another resource available on this slide that you can access. When we're thinking about choice points ask people to acknowledge and think about small choices that they have in their life that they can make. It doesn't mean that the choices available are favorable or even ideal or what they want them to be. And so there's a lot of the things that we go through and survivors experience that aren't favorable. But choice points have to figure out where there are choices that they can make in their life and what they are. So we also want to make sure that we're linking this back to hope again and what we're talking about today. So hope and choice points go together and reinforce each other. Hope allows for survivors to believe in themselves and build confidence that they are making the choices that will improve or maintain the thing that they need. Choice points will also help us identify smaller decisions, which can help lead to more opportunities in the future that they want to happen. And then starting with choices and choice points allows for survivors to hope and be actively a part of how things can eventually improve in their lives. And this becomes a circular or reciprocal process. Okay, I'm also seeing feedback that the link for choice points isn't working. Don't worry about it. After this webinar, we'll fix that and we'll make sure that you all get the resource that you need. So, diving back in, right? When we're thinking about choice points, we want to make sure that we as advocates are curious about what the person is saying. What emotions are they voicing? How do they feel about what's going on? And we will also want to keep track of where the choices are in their daily life from what they shared with us. Never at any point do we want to assume we know all the places where survivors can make choices in their life. We always want to approach survivors with appropriate curiosity about what healing and what support could look like for them. It's also important for us to note that identifying choice points isn't about choosing the choice that a person should make, rather, helping. And that is the key word, helping survivors find the choices that are available and assisting them in thinking through their options and then supporting the decision that they make. We want to make sure that we validate their choices. And when we do that, it helps survivors feel more confident. We also want to be conscious of the choices a survivor could make before, during, and after a particular situation or event. And we also want to make sure that we're grounding and we're communicating that in all of our options and not just one particular one. In doing that, we want to make sure that we keep the options simple and stick to ones that have a more definitive answer. So, for example, would you like the door open or closed? Would you like to talk now or before we take a break? We do have to leave this room right now. Would you like me to go out first or would you want to? In doing that and voicing and verbalizing different choice points, we want to make sure that we aren't unintentionally favoring one over the other. So we talked about power a little bit earlier, but we want to keep in mind that survivors may change their minds if they feel like we have an opinion on what it is that they should do. And so when we're helping survivors find choice points, we want to try to present all of them as neutrally as possible. And so here's a few examples of choice points a survivor has, even when just coming to a meeting with us. They could sit facing or away from the door, bring a drink or a snack with them, having some type of grounding material or a fidget toy, what name they would like to use and how they would like to be referred to, if and when they would like to take breaks during our meeting, Would they like to have a support person available on standby after the meeting? And would they like to practice grounding exercise after the meeting? And which ones? So if you notice, I'll try to select and put choice points in the presentation that could happen before, during, and after a meeting to just demonstrate some of the many choice points that exist. And it's important to note that the objective of choice points is identifying choices. And it's not about whether the choice is right or wrong, whether finding the choices that are available. And in reality, the right choice is a choice that's best for that particular survivor. That's the real, true thing that we want people to understand and realize. So, especially when making big life decisions, being able to help someone map out the choices that they have, even if it's not all the choices that they want, can help lower anxiety about the unknown and help survivors take back their power by identifying what choices they can make and the choice that's right for them. Okay, so with that, we are close to ending our webinar soon, but I want us to practice identifying choice points and what that can look like in our advocacy. So I'm going to read the scenario, and then once I finish reading the scenario, I would like you all to make a list and put them in the chat of the different choice points you think that Avi has in the moment. And you all have a copy of the materials, so you can read them for yourself if you would like. Avi calls your helpline the night after the incident in the bathroom. He says he's confused about what to do next, but he doesn't want to make a report. So, as a reminder, when Avi was using the bathroom, the person who sexually assaulted him came in with their friends and started recording him. From that, what are some of the choices that Avi has? What are the choice points? Avi calls into your helpline the night after the incident in the bathroom. He says he's confused about what to do next, but he doesn't want to make a report. What are some of the choices that Avi has?
This is Nora again. Someone in the chat says he could have an FME and not report now. He can report later if he wants to. He can choose to have therapy now or later.
Okay. What else? What are some other choices that are available to Avi in this moment?
Someone else says he made the right choice to call and start working on resources that he wants.
So someone's highlighting the resiliency. Yeah.
He could choose to do nothing more than call. Ask him what he would like to do next. Safety plan for how things will be at work going forward.
Absolutely right. So Avi has said that he does not want to make a report. He can do nothing at all. That is a choice that Avi gets to make. Is there more, Nora? I just want to make sure I'm not moving too fast.
That's all for right now. Oh, there's one more. What are his goals? What would he like done? And I'm proud of you for calling. Ask if he would like to talk about what happened.
Absolutely. You all are saying so many amazing things, right? You're offering that resiliency. Um, Someone else said calling was a choice he made and that all he does, that's great too. You all, thank you so much. I like hearing from such amazing advocates, right? So acknowledging calling was a choice and he's made it. And if all he does, that's great. Offering that resilient, offering that validation. Um, Asking Avi what are his goals, what would he like to do, right? That's a choice he can make. Share what he likes to do, share his goals. Maybe he doesn't have any. That does he want to think about it? That's a choice. Nora, can you reread some of the ones that were already mentioned, please?
Yes, of course. Get to he could have an FME and not report now. He can report later if he wants to. He can choose to have therapy now or later. He made the right choice to call and start working on resources that he wants. He could choose to do nothing more than call. Ask him what he'd like to do next. Safety plan for how things will be at work going forward. What are his goals? What would he like done? I'm proud of you for calling. Ask if he would like to talk about what happened. Calling was a choice he has made, and if that is all he does, that's great too.
Thank you. And so you all listed so many of those choices. I want to also reemphasize that for choice points, we want to start with the smaller choices that can then lead to larger choices, right? And so going to therapy or getting a medical forensic exam is more of a larger choice that we can eventually get to. And we want to make sure that we're recognizing all the different choices Avi might have leading up to those things, right? But that is a choice that Avi has, and it's great that someone mentioned them. Some of the choices that I identified with this scenario were discussing what happens or not, discussing how he's feeling, telling his supervisor what happened or not, telling other people what happened, forming a safety plan, and someone mentioned that, doing grounding exercises over the phone, and making a plan for going to work, right? So these are just some of the different choice points that Avi might have. There are choices that Avi has while on the phone with us, and there are some choices that Avi might have after being on the phone with us. And so the part of choice points that we really want people to understand is how to help survivors identify all the different ones that they may have. Not to overwhelm them, but to, again, feel, help them find their power and making the decisions that are the best for them in the reality of their situations. And we also want to remember our role as advocates is not to tell Avi what to do, but help him identify the choice that's best for him in that moment. If things develop or we learn more information, the choices might change, and that's okay. But the point of choice points is, again, what is available to choose from? What do you want from that situation? Okay. And so the very last thing that we're going to do for you all today is revisit the songs that you all put in the Mentimeter. So the reasons I asked you all to put those songs in the Mentimeter is because we have used them to create a playlist for Hope that you all can use hopefully in your programs. So Nora's gonna put that in the chat, and it's available right now on YouTube and um, in the follow-up communication about this webinar, it will also be available. So you all have a list of hopeful songs to choose from. And if you are maybe doing an overnight shift or as a warm-up in your support groups or just driving to work, hopefully this can give you all a little bit of hope too from the other people who were on the webinar today. So with that, that is the end of our time together today. Thank you all so much for joining. My information is on the slide, and if you have any questions, I'm going to stay on for about another minute. Thank you all so much.